I want to move on to the different types of population growth patterns seen in ecosystems. First is exponential growth. So populations with unlimited natural resources will grow very rapidly, and then that same population growth will decrease as resources begin to decline. I just described this one type of population growth and decline called exponential growth, which is a form of accelerated population growth or decline. This is one of many population growth models used in ecology, but I must preface this video by saying that studying population growth is a dynamic, as populations themselves are complicated, each with their own resources and habitat requirements. What model works for one species may not be the same for others, and thus all patterns discussed are generalizations to particular groups of species. Exponential growth is best seen in bacteria, since they reproduce by binary fission, thus doubling each generation. For example, if 1,000 bacterial cells were placed in a large flask with unlimited supply of nutrients, and this species divides every hour, we would expect 2,000 bacteria by hour 1, 4,000 by hour 2, and 8,000 by hour 3. After 24 hours, we would find more than 16 billion bacteria in this flask. That's because this population growth rate, which is the number of organisms added in each reproductive generation, increases with each current generation. This forms a J-shaped curve where the population begins with slow growth and then sees a nearly vertical incline in growth over a short period of time. Of course, this pattern assumes that resources are unlimited and that no bacteria die in a time frame, both of which are unrealistic. And since unlimited resources do not really exist in the real world, and organisms are constantly struggling to acquire resources, thereby competing with other members of the same species or other species, logistic growth models provide a more realistic picture. Even if exponential growth occurs, it will eventually slow or stop as resources begin to deplete. Thus, a population reaches its carrying capacity, or number of individuals a particular environment can hold. A graph of logistic growth displays a more S-shaped curve in environments where new populations settle. There are three regions of the S-shaped curve. First is the exponential stage, where growth is rapid due to plentiful resources. Second, growth slows significantly as resources become depleted. Lastly, a leveling off period occurs where the population remains relatively the same as a balance in the number of resources and members of the population occurs. Logistic growth models assume that individuals have equal access to resources and thus have an equal chance of survival. However, intraspecific competition occurs in any population due to this uneven access to resources. If a population is well below the carrying capacity, intraspecific competition is much lower. However, as populations grow, resources become more scarce and waste start to accumulate. Intraspecific competition increases. Yeast is an excellent example of an S-shaped curve in growth. Used in bread and alcohol production, yeast will grow exponentially, consuming sugars and converting them to carbon dioxide and alcohol. As the sugars decrease, there is less population growth, and finally, the amount of yeast in a given container will stabilize as sugars become more converted to alcohol and carbon dioxide. Similar S-shaped curves have been observed in wild sheep and harbor seal populations. The logistical model of population growth is useful, but it's a bit of a simplification of what can happen in the real world. The main reason why the logistical model is not always consistent is that it assumes an environment does not change, which of course is not true. The carrying capacity of a population is affected by annual climate conditions such as hot, dry summers maybe one year and then followed by a wet and cool summer the next. Natural disasters like earthquakes, tornadoes, or severe wind can change the environment, causing a shift in the carrying capacity due to the new arrangement of resources. Finally, there is interspecific competition. So not only do individuals in a population compete with each other, they must also compete with other species for resources. Nature regulates population growth in two ways. First is density-dependent factors, which are ways in which the current density of the population affects growth rate and mortality. Things such as limited space and resources fall under density dependency. The second is density-independent factors, which are things that affect population density independent of current size of the population. So most of these are natural disasters which do not discriminate between more or less dense populations. Most density-dependent factors are related to the biotic factors of an ecosystem, including competition, waste accumulation, and diseases. If a population is experiencing too much competition, the birth rate may be low while the death rate is higher. Most density-independent factors are related to abiotic factors or non-living physical or chemical components of an ecosystem. These affect populations regardless of size, thus all members of a population are equally likely to be picked off. For example, if a hurricane hits a mangrove forest, it makes no difference if the number of ibises present. Each one is likely to survive or die from the same natural disaster. Bear in mind that both density-dependent and density-independent factors can interact with each other. It would be easier for a more dense ibis population to recover than one that was small to begin with. Life histories do not always account for limited resources and competition. Because of this, species can be placed on a continuum of K and R selected species. These refer to species' reproductive strategies as related to how they obtain resources and care for their young. K-selected species are named for populations of species that are controlled more by their carrying capacity. Thus, they thrive in stable and more predictable environments. Population size stays relatively stable, and interspecific competition is high. Most K-selected species have fewer offspring, but exhibit more parental care. They have large body sizes and are long-lived. In plants, parental care is defined by how long it takes to develop the fruit. Examples of K-selected species include primates and elephants, as well as many tree species like oaks. Survival of the species occurs by having fewer offspring, but greatly increasing the chances of those offspring surviving due to more parental care. R-selected species are named for populations whose size is more dependent on their rate of growth. Thus, populations fluctuate based on density-independent factors more so than dependent ones. Typically, these organisms are smaller sized, live in unpredictable and changing environments, have lots of offspring, with most dying off and a few making it to adulthood. They also exhibit little to no parental care. Examples of animals that lean more R-selected include marine invertebrates and jellyfish, but also plants like dandelions and grasses that produce fruits with very little nutrients. Survival of the species occurs by making lots of offspring, betting that a few will make it to the next generation. In our next video, we will look at human populations and their relationship to Earth.